The third part of this three-part series on the island of 7 cities deals with the indigenous people of Cape Breton, the people who were living here when Europeans first arrived, the people who were living here when it was known as the island of 7 cities. The people who are native to this region are called the Mi'kmaq. They still live in the region. This is a late 19th century painting of a young Mi'kmaq woman. The Mi'kmaq were a nation that was referred to by the first European settlers in ways unlike any other indigenous people in the New World. One of the most telling remarks regarding the Mi'kmaq and how they were perceived by early European visitors was made in the middle of the 18th century by a Catholic missionary who lived among them, Pierre Millard. In 1758, Millard wrote a book about the Mi'kmaq of Cape Breton in which he asked the question, "Where does this remarkable people come from?" And he wrote, "Possibly some light might be got into it by discovering whether there was any affinity or not between their language, the Mi'kmaq language, and that of the Orientalists as the Chinese or Tartars." The Chinese or Tartars, he wrote. This is an early 20th century photograph of a Mi'kmaq couple. In these photographs showing the traditional Mi'kmaq clothing, we can see clear similarities between the Mi'kmaq and the Chinese. The short jacket, bordered along the edges, worn over a long skirt, decorated with multiple horizontal lines of various embroidered designs. The Mi'kmaq clothing on the left is almost identical to that worn by women in China, as shown on the right. And these curious hats worn by the Mi'kmaq women are worn only by the Mi'kmaq women. These hats were unique in the New World. The hat on the left is traditional Mi'kmaq, the hat on the right is Chinese. We find the same parallels in the many decorative patterns used by the Mi'kmaq, in their crafts and on their clothing. This is the traditional Mi'kmaq design of their 8-pointed star. The Chinese use an identical decorative pattern. For many reasons, the Mi'kmaq were considered unique in the New World. It was reported by early visitors that they had their own written language, the only native nation that did. They were reading and writing, even the children, in their own script when Europeans arrived. This is a copy of that script seen through European eyes, dated 1737. It had been recopied and changed by Christian missionaries, but certain symbols remained, many all but identical to Chinese characters. In the mid-19th century, this man, Silas Tertius Rand, a Nova Scotian Baptist minister and an internationally respected scholar of languages who could read, write, and speak a dozen or so, questioned if the Mi'kmaq had some origin in the Chinese. He said this about Mi'kmaq writing, using for this purpose not letters but characters, after the manner of the Chinese. Now, it was not only missionaries and language scholars who thought of Cape Breton as a land of the Chinese. After John Cabot claimed in 1497 that Cape Breton was the famous island of 7 cities, unusual reports began to appear. This is the title page from a 16th century book of navigation written by Jean Alphonse, Jacques Cartier's navigator. In his sailing directions for the Atlantic coast of Canada, published in 1559, he wrote that, starting at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, it was about 400 leagues to a place called Tartary, a term meaning the place of the Tartars or the Chinese. Tartar was synonymous with Chinese. These were sailing directions to Cape Breton. He called Cape Breton Island the land of the Chinese. Jean Alphonse, Pierre Millard, Silas Tertius Rand, a navigator, a Christian missionary, and a language scholar, each from a different period in history, each in his own way, all pointing in the direction of China, all suggesting that this small region of Cape Breton, this island in the Atlantic, once referred to as the Island of 7 Cities, had some connection with China and the Chinese. It seems unfathomable, but the Mi'kmaq oral history tells of an ancient visitor, a wise teacher who once lived among the Mi'kmaq, a teacher who had come to them by the ocean on a boat the size of a floating island, who had taught them and then left just before the coming of the Europeans. He sailed back to his home on the other side of the world. This man, who the Mi'kmaq still called Glooskap, had been a wise teacher, and we know that the Chinese ambassadors who accompanied the large fleets would have had a rigorous education. They would have been able to recite the writings of the great Chinese thinkers from memory. Glooskap arrived on a ship the size of an island, and we know that many of the ships in the Chinese fleet were over 400 feet long. They were longer by hundreds of feet than anything being built in Europe. And Glooskap left when he realized Europeans were beginning to arrive. The Mi'kmaq claim that Glooskap told them, their land would no longer be their own. According to the Mi'kmaq, Glooskap then sailed to the other side of the world. The other side of the world, opposite Cape Breton Island, is China. This question of Glooskap's origin is one of the most important in the history of the European Age of Discovery. Who visited here? What wise teacher before the coming of Europeans? To review the elements from which this theory has evolved, those pieces of evidence suggest that someone was here before Europeans started colonizing. A site of mysterious ruins located near the top of a mountain with a road leading up to it, lined by stone walls, a road that can be seen on aerial photographs taken before any modern construction in the area. The remains of a linear stone element around the site, like a river of stone in parts, that suggests the remains of a wall, specifically an earth wall with a stone base. A large rectangular cleared open space the size of a small town, dotted with the remains of what appear to have been flat rectangular stone platforms, just the way the Chinese would have built. Beyond is the cleared land on the plateau. It has no history in early settlement, no Europeans ever built here, yet there are the remains of large adjoining plots of what appear to have been farmland. And the Mi'kmaq, their clothing, the hats, the patterns on their clothing, in their craftwork, and their written language that was consistently compared to Chinese by early scholars of the Mi'kmaq language. And it was believed to be the island of 7 cities, drawn by Columbus before his visit to the New World. Copied from what source, we have to ask. The island was known of and searched for by European kings, and it was discovered by John Cabot in 1497. And in the early centuries of European settlement, the island was still referred to as Tartary, the home of the Tartars, a term once used in Europe to describe the Chinese. In the early years of the 15th century, the Chinese had the ships, hundreds of them, the crew, tens of thousands of them, and the drive to sail to the ends of the world. It would be surprising if they had not sailed to America. It is a remarkable place. This is a view looking down the town site out to the ocean. The theory is rich and varied, and the idea that the Chinese settled here on Cape Breton Island in the early 15th century simply makes a great deal of sense.